All right. So we've talked about kind of the general funding types that we have. Now we're going to get into a little more specific in the federal aid highway program, how we actually use the money that we have. So in this, we're going to talk about the Highway Trust Fund, why we have it, why it was established. We're going to talk about the source of the funding for the Highway Trust Fund. We're going to talk about the apportioned programs for FAST Act. Then we're also going to get into allocated programs. We're going to talk about the difference between an apportioned program and an allocated program. We're going to explain how certain programs are set aside from apportioned programs. We mentioned a little bit ago about the SPR funds being a set aside. And then we're going to describe the characteristics of obligation limitation. All right. So the Highway Trust Fund was enacted in 1956 to establish a dedicated source of revenue to pay for the interstate system. At the time, as we talked about, roads were going part way, not all the way, and it affected the mobility across the United States, where it couldn't go from one side of the country to the other side of the country. We were moving a lot of freight at the time, increasing that way, or using roads for freight. So in 1956, they designated a specific way to collect revenue to support the infrastructure. FAST Act, so we walked through that road of authorization acts from 1916, 1921 to today, FAST Act. So it provided, again, authorization from FY fiscal years 2016 through 2020, and it extended the Highway Trust Fund to September 30, 2022. They don't line up, do they? Who can tell me why the trust fund and our authorization may not line up? For extensions? A little bit. So a period of eligibility, your funding. Do you want to have your source of revenue end exactly when your contract authority ends? No. You want to be able to have the ability to pay invoices even after the contract authority has expired. So the Highway Trust Fund has its own period of performance, if you want to call it a period of eligibility, that goes through September 30, 2022. It always goes 2 years longer than whatever authorization we're operating under. So this is the fun part. This is how the funds go into the the Highway Trust Fund. 18.4 cents on the gallon of gasoline is given to the trust fund, and on diesel it's 24.4 cents. You can see here there are some set-asides. 1 penny on every gallon goes to the LUST. Does anybody know what the LUST stands for?
Leaking underground storage.
Right. Very scary to think about, but yes, leaking underground storage mitigation. The gas tax, 15.44% or cents goes to the highway account, and then mass transit gets 2.86 cents. And you can see the diesel. Who can tell me when the amount of 18.4 cents is? Anybody, random trivia, you play trivia. When was 18.4 cents established? 93. Yep, 94, 93. We have actually not had a raise in federal gas tax since 1993. So that's part of why we have the problem we have today with the Highway Trust Fund, because we're not keeping up. It's not even keeping up with the rate of inflation, let alone the needs of an aging infrastructure. So that's kind of a fun fact you can share at your next dinner party when everybody's complaining about taxes. So part of this, the conundrum that Federal Highway is working with now, and your DOT might be as well, is as we move into high efficiency vehicles, electric vehicles, what is that going to look like for the Highway Trust Fund if they're not using the amount of fuel that we have been using previously? So there's a lot of things that they're exploring, Congress is exploring, whether it's a vehicle mile travel tax, a user fee. Those are all things that they're looking at to help offset what was going into the Highway Trust Fund. There's also a little bit of money that's put into the trust fund from federal truck users taxes, truck sales, truck use, and tires. So the tires, that's assessed at the manufacturer level, but you can see here there's a tax on the truck sales and then the truck use that goes into it. But this is a minimal amount of money going into the Highway Trust Fund. So net highway account income. This is a breakdown showing you what we just talked about. Gasoline is 22.1 billion into the Highway Trust Fund. And then diesel, truck use, truck sales, total net is $37.9 billion. I believe, how much was the last authorization? Was $60 billion that we needed? So 50. The offset. We had to have an offset from the general fund, $70 billion. So this collected $37.9 billion. So that's why there's such a challenge with the trust fund. All right. So we talked about under the under the Authorization Acts, the apportionments. It's defined by law. It's specified under FAST Act. FAST Act took us from 13 different formulas in MAP 21 down to one formula. So there used to be all these computations that Federal Highway would have to run to see how much money ODOT was going to get in their specific program areas annually. FAST Act simplified all that for us, took us down to just one. The states that put the most in get the most out type scenario. It's distributed, as we talked about, on October 1st. It's only withdrawn by law. Earlier this year, we thought we were going to have to go through a rescission. All the states were trying to figure out how they were going to come up with funding to offset the rescission. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But all the states are recipients, and 92% of our highway funds are actually apportioned. So they're given directly to the state without coming to headquarters at all. On the other side of the house, we have allocated programs. So these are funds. There is no formula. They're distributed randomly throughout the year. They're discretionary. They can be distributed by competition. We talked about the Competitive Highway Bridge Program. That's one of our newer allocated programs. Does anybody work with infra or build programs back here? Yep. So those are allocated programs you've competed for. Only some states are recipients. These aren't guaranteed to every state typically. It's usually based on some form of competition. Some of the funding can be used for federal highway purposes. We talked about EDC, the Everyday Counts program, the STIC and aid demo grants that they get. That's actually an offset from our R&D funding. So we actually get a portion of it set aside for us too. 8% of the federal highway funds are allocated, but they also carry a larger risk to the federal highway because they are discretionary. There is no formula. They are given for a specific purpose, and so where I was going with my eligible and allowable and got turned around, they're given to you for a very specific purpose. Do any of you work with an allocated program? I saw the infra and build, but for the program folks, do any of you work with them? Okay, it's all right.
Allocated funds competitive.
Good question. So the question was, are all allocated funds competitive grants? And the answer is no. So some programs, for example, in the EDC world, the STIC, every state gets $100,000 a year regardless. It's not competitive. Emergency relief is not competitive. It is based on need. It's not necessarily, you're not competing against another state for that money. Sometimes we work specifically with a state on the research side. I know we do have, in the past, we've done some equipment loan demonstration programs where we've given money to a state to buy a specific piece of equipment, generally on the paving side, to use on the road, and then report back to us how it's working, essentially doing research for us, collecting data. So no, they are not all issued. But they all come, so apportioned funds are directly made available to you in FEMAS. An allocated program is coming through a memo from a program office and headquarters typically through FEMAS to the state with a specific period of availability, a specific amount, and a specific eligibility. Does that make sense, everybody? This might be a Kahoot question. So does everybody understand? Apportioned is by formula. It's already established in law. Allocated is discretionary. It's based on what your program is.
We're going to talk about it later, but if you go to that federal share handout in the back of your book, it actually gives every single formula, then the formula set-asides are in blue, and then all these bright ones are the allocated programs. So you can see all of the programs that we have out here, but we'll reference back to this when we talk about federal share, but this does give you the list that we have of all of our programs. And like federal lands is one of our biggest allocated programs, but those are not, federal lands gets those every year.
All right, so just as a reminder, our apportioned programs are Alphabet Soup, NHPP, STBG, CMAC, HSIP, Planning, and Freight. Here are some just a portion of the allocated programs that you might run into. Bob was just talking about the Federal Land Transportation Program, TTP, the tribal program, work zone safety, highway use. Probably don't have any. You wouldn't have ferry boats here, do you? Okay. You have a ferry boat?
Well, we got the grant.
Oh, you have a grant for a ferry boat?
Yeah.
Do you have a ferry boat? City has. Oh, okay.
We
Okay.
transfer the money directly.
To the city. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. TIFIA, the credit program, and then you have TIFIA. Oh, you are? Okay. Great. So you're closing the TIFIA, meaning you're getting it, not closing it out. You're going to closing on your loan. Okay. Okay, great. So these are just some selected. As I said, you could get research funding from us, STIC, a demo, DBE, your Disadvantaged Business Enterprises funding that you get every year, OJT Supportive Services funding. That's on-the-job technical support services funding. Those are allocated programs. They are coming to you through a discretionary. So this perfect tie-in to your innovative project financing. There's different innovative approaches to developing financing for your project. Sounds like you've got your first TIFIA. Do you have a state infrastructure bank?
No, we do not.
Okay.
But we are doing an innovative, our first P3 program with the Turnpike Authority.
Okay.
We're using Garvey bonds and TIFIA loans, and they're going to do some based on those. So yeah, so our percentage is just starting.
Wow. Okay, so it sounds like you guys have quite. Did everybody hear what Carl said that you're doing? Maybe I'll let Carl just. It sounds like Oklahoma is really embracing innovative finance, which is exciting.
Yeah, we're in the process of starting our first, they call it a P3 program, public-private partnership, and we're doing it with the Turnpike Authority, and they're building a turnpike over in Tulsa area in the Gilcrease Expressway. And they have taken out Garvey bonds and TIFIA loans, and they're going to use some of the tolling to pay that back. Mm-hmm. So it's just starting right now, and most of you probably have heard about it, but it's going to be a 3-year project. And have like 22 bridges on this project, so it's really big. I think the construction cost on it, and I'm probably going to get these numbers wrong, is $265 million, and the total project cost is going to be about $350 million. So
wow, that's exciting.
those are approximate numbers. Don't hold me to those numbers.
Yeah. So does everybody understand what a public-private partnership is? Public-private partnership, the DOT is partnering with a private company. Indiana did this. They partnered with actually an Australian company. The interstate system, I-80/90, that runs across the top of Indiana, right through my hometown, it's actually owned by an Australian company now. So it's DOT, the Indiana DOT oversees maintenance and all the safety features and everything of the road, but it's actually owned, and the revenue collected goes to the Australian company. So it's kind of interesting. Was a little unusual. My family called me when it happened, and they said, "What do you mean an Australian company is going to own our road?" But it's an interesting way of partnering with the private sector to get the revenue we need to be able to do the work we need to do. Toll credits, that's an interesting, so toll credits, that is basically a soft match. We talked about the matching requirements, 80/20. The funds that are collected from a toll facility that aren't used for the maintenance of the facility can be used to offset the matching requirements of the other funding that you use, so to match your federal funds. You can't match federal with federal typically, but your soft match, your toll credits, can be used to meet your matching requirements.
Oklahoma uses toll credits also, which makes almost our program 100% financed also.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah, that's always a question at the headquarters level when my engineers come to me and they said, "I'd like to give money to this state, but it comes with a 20% match. I don't know if they're going to be able to handle it." And I keep telling people, don't worry about the match. They've got it. They know what they're doing. They do it all the time. So exactly that. All right. So the FAST Act apportionment formula, like I said, under MAP 21, we had 13 different formulas. Now we are down to just one. After distribution of the freight and CMAQ and public planning funds, the formula you can see there. I won't go into great detail, but that's basically the breakdown of how the funds are apportioned. All right, this is a fun table. We were talking about the set-asides, the SPR funds. Where do they come from? And the answer to that is all of your apportioned funds have a set-aside on it, 2% for SPR, for your state planning and research funds. Railway and highway crossing has a set-aside from the safety funds, typically 230 to 350 million annually, or nationally annually. Your STBG, Bob talked about that, your off-system bridges, you can use funding from your STBG to support off-system bridges. We talked about earlier, STBG being your most flexible source of funding. So you also can use it for rec trails, and then your transportation alternative programs. And that's typically 835 to 850 million nationally. Those are the set-asides. That's where your additional flexibility in your funding and how you execute your program can come from.
I have a question. Recently, we had to deal with what the statutory formulas consist of, whether or not, looks like we, as you said, we transitioned from MAP 21 to FAST Act, and there's still some questions whether or not all of the factors that went into coming up with the distribution formulas
Made it into.
have been retained, or some of them, because we were in particular concerned about certain contributions related to mileage, DMT, etc.
Okay.
Is that still something that it appears at the time it said we've done away with those and we're no longer using those as basis for
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and just to repeat, make sure I understand. So there's some concern, and this slide might show you, if you look right there where it says amount equal to state's FY 2009 rec trails apportionment. So prior to MAP 21 in Safety Lou, which expired in 2009, we had these very complex formulas, which included vehicle miles traveled, population, and every single program had its own formula. And I'm not exactly sure of all the formulas, but just as an example, I think interstate maintenance, when we had a separate individual interstate maintenance pot of money, and the states received that based on 33 1/3 of it you got based on your vehicle miles traveled. 33 1/3 I think was based on population, and 33 1/3 was based on lane miles of your interstate. And so every state got their interstate maintenance pot of money based on those factors. And every single program, you know, we used to have 13 formula programs, now we have 6, but every single formula program had its own individual formula. So what MAP 21 did and what the FAST Act did was it simplified that. But they use a lot of those proportions based on the 2009 numbers, which does include that really old data. So with this next legislation, I think, and I'm not sure what they're going to do, but they have to start thinking about what other methods can we use to distribute these funds, because if we're using population of 2009 population and now we're in 2021 or 2020, that's a long time period to have your population change. If we're talking VMT, vehicle miles traveled, you know, that's not going to be accurate either. So right now, MAP 21 and the FAST Act, we are still using those really old data because we have to go back, because they did simplify it, we still have to use those same proportions though. So they go back and they'll say, okay, we're going to give you rec trails in the amount that you received back in 2009, and that might be based on some 2009 formula or numbers or population, which may not be accurate anymore. But for the FAST Act and for MAP 21, we have to use those 2009 numbers. For this next legislation, we'll just have to see what Congress does as far as figuring out how we're going to, you know, distribute these funds on a fair basis. Now, one of the other things I think Laura mentioned on equity is one of the things that we do now is we do this 95% test, because we have these donor-donee states. So we have some states that donate more to the trust fund than they actually get in federal funds, and we have some states, like my home state of Wyoming, who doesn't even get close to what they donate to the trust fund, they get way more than what they actually donate. So what we do is we do a 95% test every year to make sure that every state gets at least 95% of what they contribute to the trust fund each year. And if they don't, based on the basic formula, then we do adjustments. We'll have to give them some additional money and then reduce funds for every other state. Then we run the 95 test again, make sure that once we decrease some of those, that some other states didn't become not qualified, and then if they did, then we would have to give them some extra, because we only get one pot of money, so we have to kind of work it around and raise up the states that need to get additional funds and reduce the states down. And so we keep running that 95 test until everybody gets at least 95% of what they contribute to the trust fund. But yeah, that's a good point. We're still using that old data, and that's in the law, so we have to continue to do that, but we should be figuring out what we're going to do in the next legislation, because using 2009 information is probably not accurate when we're in 2020.
Well, I bring that up because I think the state was concerned when we were doing some DMT, HPMS and DMT issues. They thought that if they alter the way they're doing the accounts as they had done, it would affect their distribution formula. So we assured them that it would not. But
Yeah.
as you're saying, it looks like that's going to come back.
Well, I don't think it's going to come back. I think they're going to keep it simplified. I guess the biggest thing is if we're using, let's say, population of 2009 as your basis for how much money you get in a particular program, we do need to relook at that, but they're not going to make any adjustments. It's not going to impact them now, but it could possibly impact them in future legislation, because we don't know what the next legislation is going to look like, how they're going to distribute funds. But it should be based on more accurate numbers, I would think. And I know Nevada, where I also worked in Nevada, well, they have the highest federal share, 95%. Well, they're concerned because they've done a lot of land transfers between the federal government, and so they're concerned that they're going to have less federal lands in their state, which is going to make their federal share go down from 95.5 down to, say, 92, and they're concerned about that extra 2 or 3% that they're going to have to come up with in state dollars. And that's another impact. So there's a lot of things that can impact your funds, but once Congress passes a law, we're going to be bound by that until we get a new law.
Yep. Thank you. Any other questions? I do want to point out before we move off this slide, your transportation alternative funding set aside, that has to be administered by a local agency. All right. So obligations, we touched on this a little bit earlier. An obligation, it's a state request and a federal approved. It commits your state's line of credit, but it commits us to paying the federal share of the eligible expenses. As Bob mentioned earlier, it's based on your best cost estimate, so constantly making sure you've got a good estimate in place. Obligated funds do not lapse. So we talked about the period of availability of typically fiscal plus 3, depends on the type of funding. But if the funds are obligated to a contract, those aren't going to lapse. Can somebody tell me why? So if I want to do home improvement, I call a contractor and I want to say, I want to remodel my shower, and he comes in and he says, okay, great, that'll be $6,000. I said, okay, I got it, $6,000. I'm gonna pay that for you. Pay that, and along the way I give him draws. So I give him $1,000 when I sign the contract. I give him $1,000, when he demos it, so forth. He gets to the end, and we hit 5,000. I need to give him another $1,000. I say, oh, I'm so sorry, my funding lapsed. I don't have any funds. Is that going to work? Is that home improvement guy ever going to come back to my house and do anything? No. I might find myself in court, actually. So that's why. The funds, they're obligated to a contract or how your project agreement, they're not going to lapse because we've made a commitment. We are going to pay for this. And some projects can take a really long time to actually do. So they will not lapse. This is typically, the obligation is a point of budgetary control. Your funds are fully committed. You've made the commitment that you're going to do the work. All right, so now we get into obligation limitation. So what is it? Congress put a budgetary control in place that tells us how much of the contract authority we've been given we're allowed to use each year. They do this through legislation. It's set through FAST Act. It tells us every year how much we can have and use. And the reason is to be responsive to current policies and budgets. So, what is it? Obligation limitation is good for 1 year. We talked about the FAST Act being good for 5 years. Your obligation limitation is exactly what we said, annual. It's a 1 year limit on what we're allowed to spend. Each state gets a limit, and then but it applies to the total program. So does anybody work with August redistribution? You do? You do? Yeah. So in August, you're typically looking at your obligation rate. You're looking to see what you've got left, what you need still. You're looking at your programs. You might turn back some limitation from your STBG to be able to use it on NHPP, something like that. But it's good for 1 year. In FY17, the limitation percentage for the states was 92.8%. So of your total budget, you can use 92.8% of it. You said your husband is really into fishing. So hopefully this maybe makes a lot of sense to you. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me at the first time because I don't fish. But, well, actually, yeah. So my understanding is when you go fishing, there's a catch limit. How many fish? Now, I know a lot of people who hunt. So I do know that there's a limit on hunting. I guess it's kind of the same thing. The Department of Natural Resources tells you exactly how many fish you're allowed to catch. They set the limit, in this case, at 18. Do they tell you what kind of fish you can catch? They might tell you what kind you can't catch, but do they tell you can only catch, in Maryland we have rockfish. You can only catch 5 rockfish, and you can only catch, I caught a frogfish one time. You can catch like 2 frogfish. Do they tell you specifically on what type of fish you can catch? They tell you what you can't catch, but do they tell you what you have to catch? It's failing. Am I screwing this up? They're saying yes. Oh. We don't care. All right.
We understand your point.
Okay. I won't take up fishing anytime soon. Your husband doesn't have to worry. I will not be competing with him. So good thing I work for Federal Highway. I don't care what color fish you catch. So we're telling you can only catch 18. You can use 7 from the NHPP, 5 from STVG, 3 from CMAQ, or any other combination of. It's really up to you to decide what color of money you use in a given year. But we're giving you a limit on how much you can use in that year. What you don't use in a given year, though, will carry over into the next year of your funding. But your obligation limitation is only good for 1 year. Now that I've completely screwed up the whole analogy of the fishing, are there questions for Bob on it? All right. So this is a graphic showing you how long from an obligation to an outlay, essentially. An outlay is an expenditure. We've paid the invoice. So typically on a project, you get your project authorization agreement signed. The first year, you have typically, you can see here, 27% is expended. Second year, project's really getting going. You really got the invoices rolling through, 41%. And you can see as the life of the project goes on, it begins to diminish. And that's the end of Module 3. Are there questions on Module 3 before we get to Kahoot? Anything I didn't clarify? Failed on the fishing example? All right.
Yeah, basically the thing to remember on the fishing example is we had 22 fish. Is carried over into the next year. But then we have August redistribution. So come July, August timeframe of every year, we do a August redistribution, and what that does is it raises that limit. So now let's say, hey, we distributed to Oklahoma an additional 2 that you can catch. Now that 18 goes up to 20, and then you can catch 2 other ones. But you're always going to leave fish in the pond. You're always going to leave funds that you can't obligate because you never get enough obligation limitation to actually obligate all of your funds. And the reason why that is because Congress, for appropriated budget authority programs, they control spending by doing appropriations, because appropriations applies to all of these agencies. They have to have an authorization and an appropriations to do business. Most of the time their authorization is, let's say, $100 and the appropriation is $80. So they'll only get distributed $80 and they'll never ever see that other 20. But in our program, we have contract authority. Congress authorizes us 100. They say you get an obligation of 80. They'll distribute 100. We can obligate up to 80, and then that 20 is remaining and can be carried over into the next year, and it could be made up of multiple different types of funding. So it just gives states a little bit of flexibility. You're never going to be able to obligate it all, but let's say you have a really big project for, CMAQ or something, and you want to save some of your CMAQ funds until the next year to, do this really big project. You can actually do that. You can save those funds, obligate some of your other funds in this year, carry over that CMAQ into the next year, add it to your next year's apportionment of CMAQ, and then you have a lot bigger pot of money for CMAQ, and maybe you can do a really big CMAQ project. I don't know if that's a good example or not, but that's basically what it gives you, that flexibility to do. Those other programs, they'll never ever see that difference. They don't even get that additional funding. Yes. Yes, very good question. So it is set by Congress technically, but we have a lot of say of what goes into it. So when we give our concept for what the legislation is going to be, we tell Congress, hey, we think our obligation limitation should be this for each of the years. And then what happens is they put that in the actual law, in the FAST Act. We have obligation limitation for each year of the FAST Act, but we still have to abide by whatever the most current legislation is. So Congress, when they do pass appropriations, they will put what our obligation limitation is going to be in the annual appropriations every year. Most of the time, it's the same number that comes out of the FAST Act, but Congress could say, well, we want to reduce it more this year, so they'll pass it in the Appropriations Act, which will actually, be the more valid or the most recent law, and we have to follow whatever they say in the Appropriations Act. But for the most part, most of the time, it is the same number that we have in the FAST Act, and the reason why that's good is when Congress doesn't pass appropriations, we can go back to the FAST Act and say, okay, what was our obligation limitation for this year? And then we end up issuing the entire year's worth, even if Congress hasn't passed appropriations. And then when they do, let's say they only pass a continuing resolution for 3 months, we have to come back, pull all of your limitation that we gave you, and then redistribute only 3 months worth, because that's what Congress's intent is. So yeah, ultimately it's Congress that makes the decision, but we do have say in that. Okay, let's do a Kahoot. the pin's still down here if you still need to. So what is the biggest contributor to the trust fund in FY18? Yeah, so it's the gas tax. So if you remember, in 2016, the very first year of the FAST Act, the biggest contributor was the general fund, because we did a $70 billion deposit to make sure that our trust fund didn't go insolvent over the next 5 years. But yeah, in 18, it was gas tax, and that's pretty much every year. All right, Liz, Money Man, Cyber Engineer, and RAR, and a little lucky. Okay, number 2, what programs are set aside out of the NHPP program? There's only one. Yeah, so remember on the set-aside slide, we have our 5 programs. PL, there's no set-asides come out of PL, but the other 5 major programs, SPR comes out of each one of those. STBG has all of these other set-asides. So rec trails, transportation alternatives, and off-system bridge, those all come out of STBG. Ooh, Carl 2, that was a big adjustment there. Carl 2, Schwenny, Lalucky and Pickles, and the T-Rex down there. Okay, number 3, the MAP 21 transportation legislation simplified the apportionment formulas. True or false? Yeah, that's true. So the Safety Lou had all those complex formulas, MAP 21 simplified them, and then the FAST Act continued that. Oh, we just had a little adjustment there. And Melanie's the highest climber. Okay, number 4, which of the following is a characteristic of obligation limitation? Yeah, most everybody got it right. Good for 1 year. So all states share limitation. Each state gets their own piece of the limitation, so you know what it is. Each program has its own limitation. That's not true. You get limitation as a lump sum that you get to pick and choose what you want to obligate out of your programs. And federal highway does not establish obligation limitation. It's established by Congress through the Authorization Act and also appropriations. All right, Lalucky. And we still have the other folks in the top 5. Last question. True or false? Allocations are distributed on October 1st. Yeah, so that's false. What are distributed on October 1st? Apportionments, that's right. So apportionments come out on October 1st. Everybody gets apportionments. Allocations come throughout the year. There's no formula. Not everybody gets allocations. All right, and the winners. Number 3, Crying Face. Pickles, number 2. T-Rex. What? Okay, good job.